Well, hello everyone. Welcome to VLGA Connect and the governance update for this week. Now, a bit of bad news. Steve Cooper has been unavoidably detained on governance business. He's going to try and join us very, very shortly, but it actually gives me the opportunity to spend a bit of time on another topic that we've been hoping to get to for a while, and that is the recently completed local government rating review, which was handed down towards the end of 2020 with 56 recommendations, 30 odd of which the government has accepted either in full or in part, but 18 have not been accepted due to COVID for the most part. I'm going to spend some time now speaking with Mark Davies about the rating review and why he thinks it's perhaps a missed opportunity. Mark Davies, a former local government CEO and a consultant to the sector, joins me now to talk about the recently completed rating review. Mark, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Can you tell us a bit about what was the scope of this review from the outset?
Well, look, it was a fairly wide-ranging review, the terms of reference. So I guess the key one was around the equity and fairness of the rating system, how it sort of interacts with taxation. I think many ratepayers are a bit confused about it being a tax, but essentially that's what rates are. Also having a look at the way properties are valued. So the Valuer General now undertakes all the valuations on an annual basis across local government, and just looking at how that process is carried out and how transparent it is. And I guess just looking at some of the other components of the rating system, keeping in mind that despite the fact that we have a new Local Government Act 2020, the rating provisions, we're still operating under the 1989 Act, because we're waiting for the outcome of this review. So yeah, it was fairly wide-ranging, and I guess it's probably worth remembering, because this really started from a campaign from the Victorian Farmers Federation prior to the last state election, where there'd been some significant increases in farming valuations, which have moved the rate burden to them. And I think they saw that there was an opportunity to have a review, and the timing was right. So really, yes, the VFF were I guess the key drivers of this that really came from the basis of farming properties. But it certainly has relevance across the whole sector.
So pretty broad by the sounds of it. I know it took quite some time to conduct, and it was ultimately delivered as promised by the end of last calendar year. Who actually conducted the review, Mark?
There was a panel. I don't have their names, but there was certainly senior local government ex-CEOs, former Valuer General, former Commissioner on the Central Service Commission. So quite an impressive panel of people who were brought together to undertake the review, and it was very comprehensive. In having a read through the review, they'd done a lot of research into other jurisdictions and overseas. They spent a lot of time actually going out around the state and actually talking to local government professionals, CEOs, councillors, ratepayers. So they'd really done a really good job of doing all that research and backgrounding to sort of bring the review together.
So it was an expert panel, quite clearly. In terms of the findings, I think there were 50-something findings from the review. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. What were the most significant ones in your view?
Yeah, 56 recommendations, so quite a lot. And maybe initially, because it was such a broad range of review, the recommendation was sort of grouped together under particular headings. So one of the areas they looked at was trying to make general rates sort of a bit more sort of transparent, better targeting rate relief, particularly in this sort of COVID environment that we're in. How does the rating system respond to ratepayers who are unable to pay their rates or having payment difficulties? I guess just generally improving the confidence in the rating system. It's a complex system. I don't think many ratepayers really understand how it operates, and also looking at sort of some alternative rate arrangements. So if we just pick out a few, recommendation one, which I think is a good one, you may recall, Chris, that there's been a number of challenges to local governments about whether they could legally levy rates on properties. And so number one is really about saying that it describes rates as a tax and makes it very clear that councils do have the legal power to levy rates on properties. So that's a good one. And I think also just clearing up the fact that it is a tax. So for a lot of ratepayers, I think they struggle a bit. They sort of, they think about, well, I'm paying rates, what services do I use? What's the connection between the amount of rates I pay and how many services I consume? And I think by making it very clear that it is a tax on property, and there is actually no connection between the amount you pay and the amount of services that you consume. So a pretty good one to start off with.
I'm assuming, though, this review or the outcome doesn't change the fact that it's still the only tax that gets levied that you receive a bill for, effectively.
That's correct. I'm sure, having been a CEO, if we could find some other way, maybe through the tax system to levy rates, that might make it less transparent. But you're quite right. It continues to be the only tax that we get a bill for. I guess, yeah, we might argue that's good for transparency, but it does, again, puts it up in headlights about what it's all about.
Well, it does, and it obscures the fact that it's a very small percentage of the tax that we all actually pay, which creates problems, I guess, for having that discussion about the fairness and the equity.
The other one was really having a look at how the Valuer General undertakes valuations. So if I sort of go back to the Victorian Farmers Federation sort of view on all this, that there was a view that it's not very transparent. Obviously, property valuations is a complex area. The premise is that they look for sales of similar type properties, in the area when they're undertaking valuations, and use that as the basis for setting the market value, which in the residential environment works fine. There's a lot of turnover of residential properties, but if you take a farm property, maybe up in the Mallee, where properties don't turn over very often, and there's been a lot of aggregation of properties, so really neighbours buying out other neighbours, and so often prices are pushed up well above market price. And so there were some questions about, well, how transparent is, how could the Valuer General set a valuation for a property if there's only been one or none sales, in recent history? So it was really about getting, this recommendation is really about trying to get the valuation of the Valuer General to publish online or make transparent about how he actually goes about undertaking valuations, and in particular those really difficult ones like farming properties where there's not many sales, or even shopping centres, another very complex property. And again, shopping centres don't turn over very often. How do they go about sort of valuing those things? So just trying to make that all a bit more sort of transparent, which I think is a good thing. In terms of the equity side of the argument, probably the only recommendation that really went to that was looking at averaging valuation changes. So at the moment, valuations occur on an annual basis. So and so if the valuation of a particular property goes up quite considerably in 1 year, then the rates will be based on that. And so you can imagine, from year to year, there can be quite large fluctuations in property values depending on the market. And so what recommendation 7 is really saying is, well, look, it might be better to have an averaging approach where we look after over the last 4 or 5 years of changing in property valuations, and we average those, just trying to smooth, I guess, those really sort of sudden changes in rate increases. Which is consistent with the new Act, which talks about that there needs to be some stability in the amount of rates that ratepayers pay. So that's probably the only one I could find that did something about equity. You might argue that it might do something about fairness as well.
But you believe there's possibly a missed opportunity?
I guess if we had to do a bit of a history lesson, prior to rate capping, of course, decisions about rate increases at the local government level obviously were made by individual councils over many years, and so the size of council's rate base is, reflects a number of things. One, it obviously reflects the amount of properties that are in the municipality, the number and level of services that it's providing, and so over many years the rate base has grown in accordance with that. And so we could take an example where a council might have had a bit of an aggressive approach to increasing rates, maybe 5, 6, 7 or 8% per year over a number of years, and that would have grown their rate base quite considerably, as opposed to maybe a council that's taken a very conservative approach, and so their rate base has only really grown in accordance with the growth in the properties. So one of the problems, I guess, then is that when rate capping came in, it effectively just locked in everybody's rate base. And so the ability of a council to adjust its rate base to take account of significant issues that's focusing around viability or asset renewal is a very difficult process through the Central Services Commission. So one of the recommendations, I guess, that the VFF put out there, which is probably a bit out there, but is sort of talking about, well, do we need some sort of equalisation of the rate bases? Do we need to sort of have a look and say, well, look, if we've got two councils that are neighbours, they're essentially the same size, providing the same level of services, etc., and yet the rates in one are considerably higher than another. Well, should we do something about that? That in essence, the state government does do that through government grants, and so for smaller rural councils who are struggling to deliver a standard or core set of services, the government subsidises those. So one way to deal with that could be through a subsidisation process, which is already sort of happening. Or we do a large exercise and actually go back and sort of group councils together and do an equalisation and maybe reset the rates. Now, it's unlikely that the state government would entertain such an idea, but I guess it just goes to the heart of sort of the problem with the sort of equity and fairness of the whole system is that when you look between councils, that there's not a lot of equity in terms of the level of rates that are charged and the level of services, etc., that people receive. So look, probably a lost opportunity. The other thing is we only seem to get a new local government act every about 3 decades. So we had a 58 and an 89. We've got a 2020, so I probably won't see the next one. So probably a lost opportunity. Rewriting a local government act is a big deal. So look, I think the review does do a lot around fairness, a little bit around equity, but I think, not a lot in it, I guess, for councils.
All right, really appreciate those insights, Mark. It's probably a good thing we only get a new act every 3 decades or so. I can just hear people in the sector just thinking, gosh, if we had to go through this more regularly in terms of the work that's required to implement changes, it would be a bit daunting. But anyway, thank you very much for your time on VLGA Connect to talk about the new rating review. We do appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
And look, better late than never, Steve Cooper, you've walked in the door. We had to do some fancy footwork to fill the first 10 minutes or so of the program, but good to have you here. Where have you been?
I've been tied up on vitally important governance matters, Chris, and I just couldn't get there, but I was pleased to catch the last bit of what Mark had to say, the analysis of the rating review, and I agree with him completely regarding, that it's a missed opportunity, and perhaps Mark didn't say, but also I think there are matters outside the terms of reference that probably deserve a bit of a review as well in terms of reliance on rate revenue.
Yeah, good point. And I do wonder if COVID hadn't hit, whether there would have been a very different outcome to that whole process, and maybe it's one that the sector will somehow go back to.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point too, Chris, about COVID, that has really impacted not only the private sector, but on the capacity of government to do this sort of work when it's been so distracted elsewhere.
We really appreciate Mark's time to explain that to us today. A couple of things that I did want to get your thoughts on. So
hey, can I get in though first, Chris? Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but congratulations on Local Government Roundup. I've listened to a couple of episodes already, and I think just a terrific innovation, and well done on sort of going outside of Victoria and getting some fascinating examples of what happens elsewhere.
Thank you, Steve. I'm really enjoying doing it. I wasn't sure it would strike a chord, but the response has been fabulous, actually.
Yeah. And at the risk of upsetting a multinational, I like to describe it as the Roundup that's not toxic, but let's go any further.
No, I think that's my new catchphrase. We're going to have to redo all the artwork now. The Roundup that's not toxic. Thank you for that. There are a couple of things that caught my eye that I think warrant a little bit of unpacking, if you might. So, situation going on down at Frankston, where the council has resolved to undertake an arbitration process with one of its councillors over alleged misconduct, which relates to social media posts. But the thing that I thought was really interesting here, Steve, is when you see how the vote to proceed took place, 7 councillors voted for it. The 2 that voted against it were the councillor himself and the son of the councillor, who's also a councillor. And some people are saying, well, is there not a conflict of some sort there? I know you've looked into this.
Yeah, and I must admit, I did a bit of a double take and then thought, hang on, there is a schedule of exemptions, and I was reminded that the exemptions are in two spots. So in the Act, it talks about some sort of more general conditions for exemption. For example, if a reasonable person wouldn't reasonably think there's a conflict, then there's not, etc. But then going to the integrity regulations from the governance integrity regulations from October last year, there are a list of more specific exemptions to a conflict. And one of those is considerations by council of whether to refer matters to arbitration. Of course, that raises an interesting question as to what the legislators, and it's not kind of what were they thinking. I think they were quite clearly thinking that the councillor who's the subject of such an application ought to be in the room. I sort of wonder, and we'll never know, whether it was actually contemplated that relatives of that councillor would also be involved and perhaps form a similar view.
That's the question, isn't it? So all above board, but what it has also done is raise the question about what other familial relationships are in place on councils around the state. And we're one other at Manningham. I don't know the answer beyond that. So if any of our listeners are aware of other examples, we'd love to know about them.
Yeah, look, it's a fair point. Chris, can I make a comment more generally? And it's not about Frankston. What I'm about to say is just a general comment.
Yep.
And I think it's a useful reminder at times that the legally correct answer isn't always the ethically correct answer. And considering both of those things on matters more broadly is often a wise thing to do. Very
good point, Steve. Now, the other one that caught my eye, and I did send you an email about this as well, is a planning matter in, I forget is it Bayside? I think it might be Bayside.
It is Bayside, yes.
Yeah, involving a very well-known international basketballer who's had a development overturned by the council's planning committee and against the advice of the council's planners. It reminded me that this whole process, to an outsider looking in, can appear to be a bit hard to fathom, but it's just the way the system works, isn't it?
Oh, look, I think it is, Chris, and it's a really tough gig for councillors because there is often a whole lot of community activism around town planning matters, both for and against particular applications, often against. And the council needs to sift through the report that's provided by the expert officers. But ultimately, I think, Chris, the decision of the council, whether it's for or against, can be appealed typically by either party to VCAT or, if necessary, to the Supreme Court. And I think it's always a useful reminder for any player in the process that ultimately it is typically VCAT that might be the final arbiter.
Yes, so you
or in this particular case, referee, given that we're talking about a woman basketballer.
Indeed. So far from a slam dunk, yes. We'll keep an eye on that one. Steve, a professional note this week, we've been keeping a tally on the number of CEO positions around the state that are open, and there's another one going to be added to the list very soon. Peter Brown at Colac Otway has this week announced his intention to step down in July after 3 years in the role. Really nice fellow, Peter, and we wish him the best with whatever he's going to be doing next.
A great servant of Colac Otway and Horsham before that for many years, and I'm with you. Nice man. And I wish Peter all the best.
And did we talk about Kelly Grigsby last week on the program? I know I've talked about it on the local news roundup. Kelly Grigsby from Wyndham is going to be the new CEO of the City of Hobart from May.
What a fabulous get for the City of Hobart is all I can say about that. And good luck to Kelly with that project. She's got a fine history of achievement at Wyndham.
She certainly does. And I've had a chat with her. She's very excited, understandably so, to be relocating down there. And she's been at Wyndham as the CEO there for, I think it's 6 years. So she certainly made a massive contribution in that time. And again, she goes with all of our best wishes.
Absolutely. Hear, hear.
Steve, that's probably it for this week. Slightly longer edition than usual while we waited around for you, but we spent the time wisely learning about the rating review. Thank you.
Time well spent. Thanks, Chris. See you next week.
See you very soon. Stephen Cooper. with us as always here on the Governance Update from VLGA Connect.